Let the wheels finish her. That's what my daughter said. And I was the her. Those words still echo against the metal rails whenever a train passes, a sound so sharp it cuts through the years that have stretched between that afternoon and this one. I was 79 then, still walking steady, still believing that love, even tired, resentful love, had boundaries it would never cross. Now I'm 81, living above a laundromat that never sleeps, surrounded by the hum of other people's spinning clothes and the smell of detergent and rain. The window in my small apartment looks directly over the station where it happened. Some might call that masochism, but I call it proof. Proof that I survived the moment my own child decided I was disposable. I spend most mornings sitting by that window with a chipped mug of tea, watching the commuters blur past like ghosts who haven't yet realized they're gone. Sometimes I imagine she's among them, coat pressed, head high, pretending that her mother isn't alive to remember, pretending that she isn't the kind of person who can watch her mother fall and feel nothing but relief. That day hadn't started as tragedy. It began like most of our Sundays, me trying too hard to be welcome, her trying too hard to appear kind. Miriam had invited me for a little outing, her voice unusually bright on the phone, the kind of cheer that sounds rehearsed. Let's go see the station, Mom. They've renovated the old platforms. You used to love the trains. I said yes before thinking, because even after years of quiet cruelty, I still mistook her invitations for affection. We rode in silence, her car smelling of expensive leather and the faint perfume that always reminded me of winter apples. I tried to fill the space with small talk, about the weather, about the neighbor's dog who'd had puppies, but she only nodded, eyes on the road. When we reached the station, I felt a flutter of nostalgia. The building was older now, the clock above the entrance frozen at a time no train had kept in decades. I had spent 40 years of my life working there, first selling tickets, then managing schedules, later training dispatchers. My name was once spoken over the loudspeakers when I retired. They gave me a whistle engraved with the company's crest and a bouquet that wilted before I got home. I had loved that place because it made sense. Tracks led somewhere. Trains came and went on time. People said thank you. Life obeyed the logic of timetables. Until that day. Miriam walked beside me, her heels clicking too fast, her eyes darting from me to her phone. I told her about the old waiting hall, how it used to smell of oil and newspapers, how we used to handwrite every schedule before computers took over. She didn't answer. She never did when the subject wasn't her. When she was small, she used to wave at every train, shouting, "That one's going to the sky." I thought she'd inherited my fascination with movement, with the idea that motion meant life. Maybe she did, but not the tenderness behind it. That afternoon, the crowd was light. Tourists, a few teenagers, a vendor selling roasted chestnuts whose smoke curled into the gray winter air. I was slower climbing the stairs, and she offered her arm, though the gesture felt more like supervision than care. We stood near the edge of the platform where the yellow warning line glowed faintly beneath our feet. The train was approaching, a low hum growing into a roar. I remember thinking how beautiful it sounded, the vibration of it filling the metal ribs of the station, the way it used to when I worked the night shifts. That's when she leaned closer, her lips almost touching my ear, and whispered it like an afterthought. Let the wheels finish her. Then the push, small, almost gentle, like a breeze disguised as love. People imagine violence as loud, but betrayal is quiet. The world tilted. My vision flared white. And then, Nothing but the shriek of brakes and the smell of iron. I didn't fall all the way. My cane caught between the tiles, my body twisted, and I landed on my side. When I opened my eyes, I saw faces looking down, horrified, confused. Someone pulled me up. Someone else shouted for help. The train had stopped just feet away. The conductor jumped out, his voice booming. "Is that Mrs. Ellison? Stop everything. Mrs. Ellison's on the track." That's how I was saved, not by mercy, not by my daughter's regret, but by recognition. They remembered my name. For a brief, dizzying moment, I was someone again, not the ghost Miriam had been rehearsing to erase. She stood a few meters away, frozen, phone in hand, eyes wide but dry. When they asked what happened, she said, "She slipped." Her voice was smooth, controlled, perfect for the performance. I didn't contradict her. I didn't have the breath. They took me to the hospital. She followed at a polite distance, talking on her phone, explaining to someone that I got confused near the edge. It took me 2 days to realize that the fall had not broken my bones, but something deeper. The fragile, foolish belief that love could not mutate into indifference. I was discharged with a bruised hip, a prescription for painkillers, and a pamphlet on fall prevention for seniors. Miriam signed the papers. "You really should be more careful," she said, as if I'd embarrassed her, as if gravity had been my fault. We drove home in silence. She turned the radio on halfway through the trip, tuned to a talk show where people debated whether parents owed gratitude to their children for care. "See?" she said lightly. "Even they say we have to make hard choices sometimes." I stared out the window. The city rolled past like film footage from a life I no longer recognized. When she dropped me off, she didn't walk me inside. She handed me my bag, said she'd call tomorrow, and drove away before I reached the door. That was 2 years ago. She never called. But the trains kept running. Every night, I hear them slide through the dark, wheels singing against the rails, steady, inevitable. Each one sounds like a heartbeat I borrowed. The whistle in my memory is both wound and remedy. People tell me I should move away from here, that it's unhealthy to live with the past framed in your window. But I can't. This station is the last place where my name meant safety, where strangers shouted it not to accuse, but to save. Sometimes I imagine the conductor who stopped the train that day still tells the story about the old dispatcher who fell and lived because someone remembered. He probably doesn't mention the daughter. He probably assumes it was an accident. That's fine. Let the world believe what it wants. I know the truth, and the truth keeps me company. Now, when I walk along the platform on my way to buy groceries, I always pause where the tiles are still cracked from the emergency stop. I run my fingers over the rough edge, like reading a scar in Braille. It reminds me that life doesn't end with impact. It ends with silence, and I refuse to go quiet. I talk to strangers now, anyone who'll listen. I tell them about the schedules, about the old ticket booth that smelled of ink and iron, about the day trains ran slower because someone's name was worth stopping for. They think I'm sentimental, a lonely woman chasing ghosts. Maybe I am. But every time I speak, I take back a little of what she tried to throw away. And if one day she passes through this station again, walking fast, eyes down, pretending she doesn't see me, I'll still be here. An old woman with a steady voice and a memory that won't obey her command to disappear. Because I learned something that afternoon between the rails. Survival is not luck. It's stubbornness. And I've always been very, very stubborn. The defining act, the true fracture, came not with the whisper or the push, but in the hours that followed, when the world resumed its ordinary rhythm, and I discovered that horror could exist inside the most routine gestures. After the hospital released me that evening, wrapped in paper instructions and a borrowed coat because mine had been torn, Miriam was waiting in the lobby, sitting cross-legged like a woman in a dentist's office rather than a daughter whose mother had nearly died. She was scrolling through her phone, her mouth pursed in concentration, and when she finally looked up, the first thing she said was, "They told me you're fine." I nodded, too tired to speak. She stood, brushing invisible dust from her sleeve, and added, "Good. I was worried they'd think I pushed you." Her laugh was small, almost friendly, the kind people use to smooth over discomfort at funerals. I remember staring at her face and realizing I no longer knew the geography of it, the map of expressions that used to mean love, irritation, affection. Everything had been replaced by the cool, waxy composure of someone who knows how to perform decency, but not feel it. The nurse offered to call me a cab, but Miriam insisted on driving me. The ride was quiet, except for the click of her turn signal, steady as a metronome, each tick marking the distance between us. I stared at her hands on the steering wheel, elegant, manicured, the same hands I had once held when she was learning to write her name. I remembered how she used to press her little thumb too hard against the pencil, leaving a dent. Now she gripped the wheel the same way, hard and precise, like control itself was oxygen. When she pulled up in front of my house, she didn't turn off the engine. "I'll come by tomorrow," she said. "You need rest." I wanted to ask why. If she cared, her voice sounded like an announcement over a loudspeaker, all formality and no warmth. But I didn't. I simply nodded and stepped out into the cold air. The streetlights buzzed overhead. The pavement still smelled faintly of rain and exhaust. As her car disappeared down the road, I felt a strange stillness settle around me. A quiet, too deliberate to be peace. Inside the house, everything looked the same, but wrong, as if the furniture had been moved a few inches while I was gone. The framed photos on the mantel, Miriam as a child, my late husband in his uniform, our dog with its ridiculous red collar, seemed to look past me. I sat in the armchair, unbuttoning the hospital coat, and saw a smear of grease on the cuff. Train grease. Proof of where I had been, of what had happened. I ran my thumb over it until it blurred. That night, I didn't sleep. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the tracks stretching out in endless lines, each one leading to a different version of my death. When dawn came, it felt less like morning and more like an interrogation light. The next day, she didn't call. 2 days later, she arrived unannounced, carrying groceries, organic soup, low-sodium crackers, almond milk, and arranged them on the counter like offerings to a god she didn't believe in. "I thought you could use some help," she said. "You shouldn't be alone." I told her I'd managed alone for decades, but she brushed that aside with a gentle, condescending smile. "Mom, you've been through trauma. You might not remember everything clearly." That sentence settled like dust in my lungs. Not remember. It was the first step in a quiet campaign, though I didn't yet see it. She asked questions that weren't really questions. "You're sure you didn't lean too far forward? Maybe your shoes caught?" Each one planting a seed of doubt, not about the incident, but about my mind. I didn't argue. I just watched her tidy my kitchen, discard my bread because it was too stale, rearrange my medication because it was too confusing. By the time she left, The house smelled like antiseptic and new beginnings that weren't mine. A week passed. The bruise on my hip turned from violet to yellow. I started walking with a cane, not because I needed it, but because it gave me a sense of control. I returned to the station once, during an afternoon lull, to thank the conductor. His name was Henry Lowe, a man I'd trained decades ago when he was just starting. He looked startled to see me, as if I'd returned from the dead. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, gripping my hands. "They told me it was an accident, but I didn't believe it. You don't just fall like that." His kindness nearly undid me. I thanked him, told him I was fine, told him not to worry. When I left, he pressed something into my palm, the old silver whistle I'd given him on his promotion day. "Keep it," he said. "You might need to remind them who you are." I nodded, but my throat closed around the words I wanted to say. When I returned home, Miriam's car was already in the driveway. She was inside, sitting at my dining table with a stack of papers. "I've been going through your mail," she said matter-of-factly. "You missed a few bills? I can take over the accounts for a while." My mouth went dry. I had never missed a bill in my life. "You don't have to do that," I said. She smiled. "Mom, it's fine. Let me help." She used the same tone one might use with a child insisting on tying her own shoes. She slid the papers into her bag and stood. "Also, I told the neighbors you're a bit forgetful lately, just so they won't worry if something happens again." Her words landed softly, but they carried the weight of erasure. Forgetful. The word she would later repeat to everyone who would listen. That night, I wrote everything down in a notebook. The push, the whisper, the way the air felt against my cheek when the train stopped, the look on her face. I wrote because memory, when threatened, must become evidence. The act itself felt almost defiant, a small rebellion written in ink. I hid the notebook behind the flour jar in the kitchen, the same place I used to hide Christmas money when Miriam was little and greedy for candy. Funny how habits of survival repeat themselves. A few days later, a police officer came to my door. "Routine follow-up," he said politely, though his eyes flicked toward my cane and the bandage on my hand. "Your daughter mentioned you might want to clarify your statement about the incident." I asked what there was to clarify. He hesitated. "She said you were confused that day, that maybe you stepped forward to see the train." I told him I had worked 40 years at that station, that I knew where the line was drawn better than anyone. He nodded sympathetically, but wrote something down in his notebook anyway. When he left, I felt the last of my certainty slide somewhere unreachable. They weren't trying to prove she was innocent. They were trying to prove I was unreliable. In the following weeks, the changes were small but cumulative, like rust spreading. My bank card stopped working. Miriam said she'd merged accounts to make bill paying easier. My phone began to receive fewer calls. Later, I discovered she'd blocked numbers, even Henry's. My medications came in new bottles with her handwriting on the labels. "Take 2 before bed." When I asked which doctor had prescribed them, she said, "Don't worry about that. It's standard." The pills made me drowsy, my thoughts sluggish, as if I were walking through fog. Yet beneath that fog, something sharp remained, the instinct that once kept me alert through long nights at the control center. A voice that whispered, "Pay attention." One afternoon, I found the old whistle Henry had given me lying on the kitchen counter. I didn't remember leaving it there. It gleamed under the fluorescent light like a dare. I lifted it, feeling its cool weight, and thought about the trains, about the discipline of schedules, about how order depends on the smallest signals. One sound to stop, another to go. I put it on a string and hung it around my neck beneath my blouse. I couldn't name why it comforted me, only that it reminded me I had once been a woman other people trusted to decide when things moved and when they didn't. That realization burned quietly, like the first spark under wet wood. The true catalyst, though, was not the push or even the lies. It was the silence that followed. The world didn't break open with outrage or rescue. It simply looked away. Friends assumed I was fine because I was still breathing. The neighbors waved but stopped inviting me for tea. The loneliness that followed was not emptiness, but pressure, like the weight of unspoken truth sitting on my chest. And in that silence, I began to see what Miriam had done, not as madness, but as a calculation. She wanted inheritance before death, freedom before mourning. I had become an obstacle dressed in flesh and memory. Understanding that was the moment the last illusion of safety collapsed. So yes, the push began the fall, but the real betrayal came afterward, in the quiet efficiency of her control, in the way she rewrote the story until even I began to question the edges of it. Yet beneath every attempt to erase me, there pulsed something stubborn, a rhythm like wheels on rails. The whistle at my neck was only metal, but when I held it between my fingers, I remembered the sound it could make, the sound that once made men stop trains. And somewhere deep inside, I promised myself that if the world insisted on forgetting me, I would find a way to make it stop again. And this time, not for tragedy, but for truth. After the incident, life resumed with a distorted normalcy that felt like living inside someone else's dream, where everything looked familiar, but nothing followed the logic I remembered. The days blurred into one another, the kind of days that leave no trace when they pass. Miriam started visiting more often, not out of affection, but out of supervision. And each time she came, another small piece of my life was quietly taken away. At first, it was harmless things. The spare key to the back door, my old set of checkbooks, the framed photograph of her father that had always stood by the window. When I asked about it, she said, "I thought I'd get the frame cleaned. It looked dusty." I never saw it again. Then came the mail, which began arriving already opened, and the bills that I was told she'd handle for now. She had a way of speaking that made refusal sound ungrateful, and I had a lifetime of habits that mistook obedience for peace. I spent my mornings sitting by the kitchen window, watching the sparrows hop along the fence, trying to convince myself that nothing had truly changed. But the house had a different rhythm now, slower, heavier. The television remote stopped working because she'd canceled the unnecessary channels. The phone rang less, and when it did, she always seemed to arrive just before I could answer, her voice sugary as she said into the receiver, "Oh, Mom's resting. Can I take a message?" Eventually, the calls stopped altogether. Friends must have assumed I was too tired for company. I began keeping the notebook within reach, writing down every detail that slipped through the cracks. The missing keys, the pills that made me drowsy, the day the power bill was paid from an account I no longer recognized. Writing gave the days a kind of shape, the illusion that I could still organize my life the way I once scheduled trains, precisely, predictably, without surprises. When she wasn't there, the house echoed in ways it never had before. I caught myself listening for sounds that weren't there. The creak of my husband's chair, the radio I used to leave on for company, the rumble of freight trains that used to lull me to sleep. I started walking the rooms at night, tracing my fingers along the wallpaper, memorizing the texture of ownership as if to remind myself that the walls still knew my name, even if my daughter had started to forget it. But the house was beginning to feel like a stage set that could be dismantled at any moment. Once, I came home from a short walk to find a man in overalls inspecting the gas meter. When I asked who had called him, he said, "Your daughter arranged it." I hadn't known the gas needed checking. Around that time, I realized she had changed the locks. It happened so quietly I didn't even notice until one afternoon when I went to collect the mail and found that my old key no longer turned in the front door. Miriam appeared behind me, holding a new set. "Oh, Mom, I forgot to tell you," she said brightly, dropping the keys into my palm. "New locks for safety. You can't be too careful." There was only one key on the ring. "Where's the spare?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, "I'll keep it, just in case." I nodded, pretending it didn't matter. But that night, I dreamt I was trapped inside a moving train car with no doors, watching the landscape change through sealed windows. The fog from the new medication deepened. Some mornings, I woke with a sour taste in my mouth and a numbness that made the simplest tasks feel monumental. I once found her refilling the pill organizer, humming softly as she replaced the labels with her own handwriting. When I asked for the original prescription, she said, "Mom, please trust me. You're making this harder than it needs to be." The words stung, not because of their cruelty, but because of their calmness. She truly believed she was right. That kind of conviction is dangerous. It turns even kindness into violence. I began hiding the pills under my tongue, then spitting them into the sink when she wasn't looking. Slowly, the fog began to thin. It was during one of those half-clear mornings that I noticed my bank statement lying open on the table. The balance was smaller than it should have been. Several transfers marked with her signature. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. When I confronted her, she sighed like a weary parent correcting a child. "Mom, those are reimbursements. I've been covering your expenses. You keep forgetting." Forgetting. The word again sharpened like a blade. I wanted to shout that I remembered everything, every transaction, every hour of that afternoon at the station, every heartbeat between the rails. But I didn't. Because shouting is what they expect from the unstable, and I couldn't afford to be right and hysterical at the same time. The isolation grew. She began talking to neighbors in my absence. I caught snippets of their pity when they visited. "It's so wonderful of you to take care of her," they told her. "She's lucky to have such a devoted daughter." I smiled politely and watched the admiration in their faces, the kind people reserve for caretakers, not survivors. Once, I overheard Miriam on the phone, laughing softly. "She still thinks she's fine," she said. "It's like watching someone fade in real time." I closed the door quietly and sat on my bed, clutching the whistle beneath my blouse, until my fingers stopped trembling. I knew then that I had to do something, but the question was what? My body was slower, my resources limited, my credibility hanging by a thread already frayed by her careful narrative. Yet the mind is a resilient thing. It learns to adapt in silence. I began to create small pockets of control. I stopped telling her when I went out. I walked to the post office alone under the pretense of stretching my legs and withdrew small sums of cash, hiding them in the hem of an old winter coat. I told the pharmacist that I'd lost my prescription and asked for a copy, claiming I wanted to double-check dosages. When she handed it over, I saw at once that half the medications had never been prescribed by any doctor I knew. Some weren't even for pain. They were mild tranquilizers. I folded the paper and placed it in my pocket, like a piece of evidence in a quiet trial. The turning point came one night during a storm. The power went out, and Miriam hadn't arrived yet. I lit a candle and sat in the living room, listening to the wind rattle the windows. For the first time in months, the house felt like mine again, stripped of her presence. In the flickering light, I saw the shadow of myself reflected on the wall, thin, stooped, but still upright. That sight filled me with an unexpected tenderness. I realized that even if she succeeded in erasing me from her version of reality, I still existed in my own. The thought was small but electric, like a spark beneath the ash. After that night, I began walking to the station again, not to relive the past, but to remember who I had been before it all unraveled. I told Miriam I was visiting a friend from the dispatcher's office, and she didn't argue, perhaps because she believed I wouldn't dare venture far. At the station, I watched the trains pull in and out, their wheels shrieking against the rails. I noticed the conductors still used the same signals I had once drilled into them decades ago. There was comfort in that constancy. One afternoon, I met Henry again. He was on break, leaning against the platform railing, sipping coffee from a paper cup. "You doing all right?" he asked. "Better than they think," I replied. He smiled, though I could see the worry in his eyes. Before I left, he scribbled his number on a napkin. "If you ever need anything, call me." I folded the napkin carefully and hid it in my wallet, behind my ID. Returning home after those visits was always the hardest part. Miriam had a way of appearing suddenly, like a warden materializing at the end of a hallway. She'd stand at the doorway, arms crossed, and ask where I'd been. I started answering with half-truths. Out for air, stopped by the shop, fed the pigeons. Each time she'd nod, but her eyes would flicker with suspicion. Once she said, "You're not planning something foolish, are you?" The question lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken threat. I smiled and said, "At my age, foolishness is the only luxury left." By then, the upstairs room had become my cage. She called it your safe space. It had no lock on the inside, only outside. I discovered that one night, when I tried to step out after hearing a noise downstairs and found the handle wouldn't turn, I knocked until my knuckles ached. She appeared minutes later, wearing her robe, eyes wide with mock concern. "You shouldn't wander at night, Mom. You'll hurt yourself." I wanted to say that the real danger wasn't falling down the stairs, but living behind a door someone else controlled. Instead, I retreated to bed and waited until I heard her footsteps fade. I whispered into the darkness, "You won't finish me." The whistle lay cold against my chest, a silent ally. Weeks passed like that, with alternating days of submission and defiance. The quiet battles were invisible from the outside. No shouting, no scenes. Just a woman reclaiming tiny fragments of autonomy under the nose of someone who had mistaken power for love. I stopped taking her pills entirely. I hid food in my dresser drawer. Biscuits, apples, small sustenance for the day I might have to leave without warning. I memorized the train schedule again, not the new digital version, but the rhythm, the old intuition of timing that had never left me. Each train that passed my street reminded me that movement was still possible, that even captivity had cracks if you knew where to look. The first escalation was not a single event, but a gradual tightening of ropes, an invisible noose woven out of care, duty, and fear. Miriam believed she was protecting her future, but what she was really doing was teaching me the value of escape. And though I played my part, smiling, nodding, pretending to drift further into the fog she crafted for me, I was already mapping the tracks in my mind, counting the seconds between arrivals and departures, rehearsing the moment when I would finally step beyond her control. Because I knew one thing she didn't. Even when you stop working the rails, the body remembers the rhythm of survival, and no amount of manipulation can silence the sound of a whistle that's ready to be blown. The shift began so quietly that at first I mistook it for exhaustion, the way a long illness pretends to be sleep before it reveals itself. It started with a single sound, the whistle. I hadn't used it in months, hadn't even thought of it beyond its weight against my chest. But one night, after a day of small humiliations that seemed endless, I lifted it from beneath my blouse and held it in my palm. The metal was cool, smooth, alive somehow. I sat at the edge of the bed, the door locked from the outside, and remembered the nights decades ago when I was the one who decided whether a train stopped or went, when a single note from my signal post could save lives. The memory was both comfort and accusation. I had once commanded steel and distance. Now I was a prisoner in my own house. I raised the whistle to my lips and blew softly, not enough to make a sound, only enough to feel the vibration. It reminded me that my breath still had purpose, that I still existed beyond the version of me my daughter had constructed. That moment, small and unseen, was when the balance began to tilt back toward me. In the following days, I noticed everything more sharply. The subtle notes of her voice when she spoke to me, the way she checked her watch whenever I answered a question too quickly, the faint scent of her perfume lingering near the kitchen table where she sorted my mail. Awareness, once dormant, became my secret weapon. I started keeping track of her visits again, not in my old notebook, which she had surely found by now, but in the margins of a cookbook she'd never open. Next to recipes for stews and pastries, I wrote the times she arrived, what she took, who she called afterward. The pattern was there if you looked close enough. She always came the day before automatic payments were due, always left with a small envelope or receipt. My life had become a ledger, but at least it was a record I could control. Then came the day I decided to leave the house alone. It was mid-morning, the sky a dull, pewter gray, the kind that makes everything look washed out. I told her I needed air, and she nodded distractedly, barely glancing up from her phone. I walked to the train station with deliberate slowness, every step both a test and a declaration. The air smelled faintly of oil and rain. When I reached the platform, I sat on the bench, feeling the cold seep through my coat, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe without fear of being overheard. The trains roared in and out, indifferent and magnificent. People hurried past, their lives intact, their destinations certain. I envied their ordinariness. Henry was on duty that day, and when he saw me, his face softened into something like relief. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, "I was beginning to think you'd vanished." I told him I was still here, though not by much. He laughed, then noticed the bruise still visible on my wrist. "You need help?" he asked quietly, and I surprised myself by saying, "Not yet, but soon." I didn't explain, and he didn't press. He understood that some kinds of danger don't leave marks that can be photographed. Before I left, he gave me a folded piece of paper with his home number and said, "Keep this somewhere she won't find it." I tucked it into my shoe. That afternoon, walking home, I realized how long it had been since I'd felt the simple act of choosing my direction. Every intersection felt like defiance. I bought a newspaper at a kiosk, the first one I'd held since she'd taken over my subscriptions, and tucked it under my arm like contraband. Inside the house, I hid it under the sofa cushion and read it late that night by the glow of a small flashlight. There was something thrilling about the ordinary columns of print, about being connected again to a world that hadn't yet decided I was obsolete. The stories were mundane: politics, weather, an upcoming strike. But to me, they were proof of existence. I began taking small steps to reclaim space. I cooked dinner again, ignoring her ready-made meals stacked in the fridge. The first night she returned to find me stirring soup on the stove, her face froze. "You shouldn't be standing so long," she said, reaching for the spoon. I pulled it back gently. "It's my kitchen," I replied. The words startled even me. They came out steady, without anger. She smiled a thin smile. "Of course, Mom. I'm just worried about you." But something flickered in her eyes then, a recognition that I was no longer fully under her thumb. That night, she double-checked the lock on my door. I heard the faint click through the wall, but it no longer frightened me. Locks only matter to those who plan to stay. A few days later, I went to the post office again, this time to withdraw the rest of my small savings. The clerk, a young man with tired eyes, hesitated when he saw the withdrawal slip. "Are you sure, ma'am?" he asked. "That's most of the account." "I'm sure," I said. The money wasn't much, enough for a bus ticket, maybe a week in a cheap room, but it was freedom in paper form. I carried it home in a small envelope tucked inside the lining of my coat. I didn't know yet where I would go, only that I couldn't stay where I was. That realization didn't feel like panic. It felt like clarity. That evening, Miriam arrived earlier than usual. She seemed agitated, pacing the kitchen while talking on her phone in hushed tones. I caught fragments. Evaluation, care facility, she won't resist. The words chilled me, but I kept my face blank. When she noticed me watching, she smiled, all teeth and tension. "Just work stuff," she said. I nodded, pretending to believe her. After she went to bed, I packed a small bag, one change of clothes, my identification, the whistle, the notebook, and the envelope of money. I hid the bag behind the radiator, ready for the moment when chance would open the door. The next morning, something strange happened. The neighbor from across the street, Mrs. Patel, knocked on my door. She was a quiet woman who mostly kept to herself. "I saw your light on late last night," she said. "Everything all right?" Her voice was tentative, careful, as if she already feared the answer. I hesitated, then asked, "If you didn't see me for a few days, would you notice?" She looked surprised, but then nodded. "Of course." I thanked her and said nothing more, but that small exchange reminded me that isolation was never absolute. Sometimes it just needed a signal. Later that week, I made my move. Not a dramatic escape, but a rehearsal. When Miriam left for errands, I unlocked the back door with the old hairpin I had kept from my dispatch days. Years ago, I had learned to pick simple locks to open stuck drawers in the office. It worked now with the same precision. I stepped outside, feeling the wind on my face, and walked to the end of the street. The freedom was so sharp it almost hurt. I could have kept going, but instinct told me to wait. I turned back, locked the door behind me, and sat down at the table as if nothing had happened. The rehearsal was successful. I knew now that when the real moment came, I could leave. But the most unexpected shift was internal. I began to see her not as a villain, but as something smaller, a frightened woman clinging to control because she couldn't face her own mediocrity. She needed to make me small to feel big, needed to invent my weakness to mask her own. Understanding that didn't excuse her, but it freed me from the illusion that I had failed as a mother. Her cruelty wasn't born of my mistakes. It was the natural decay of a love that had been transactional for too long. Realizing that was like exhaling after years of holding my breath. One afternoon, while she was out, I found an old photo album she had stored away in the attic. Inside were pictures I hadn't seen in years. Her 5th birthday, our trip to the lake, my husband's retirement dinner. We looked happy, all of us. But the more I studied the images, the more I saw what had been invisible then. Her father's distance, her own practiced smiles, my desperate attempts to hold everything together. It occurred to me that maybe this betrayal had been brewing for decades, just waiting for the moment when I'd grown too old to defend myself. I closed the album and placed it back where I found it, not with sadness, but with a strange gratitude. It was a record of what had been, not what had to be again. That night, I dreamed I was back in the control room of the station, surrounded by panels of lights and levers. Each switch corresponded to a line, each whistle to a destination. In the dream, one signal kept flashing red, warning of collision. I tried to fix it, but the wires were tangled. Then I realized I wasn't trying to prevent disaster. I was trying to reroute it. I woke before dawn, the sky pale and uncertain, and for the first time in months, I smiled. Even my subconscious was reminding me that red lights weren't the end of movement. They were simply pauses before a new track opened. From that morning onward, my fear began to erode. I still pretended obedience, took her calls, accepted her meals, listened to her lectures, but inside, something solid had returned. I wasn't waiting for rescue anymore. I was preparing for departure. I didn't know yet when or how, but the rhythm of trains outside my window had become a metronome for courage, a reminder that everything moves eventually, even the things that once seemed permanently stuck. And when the time came, I would not whisper for help or cry for mercy. I would do what I had always done, read the signals, choose the right moment, and act. Because the woman she tried to bury wasn't gone. She was only waiting for the whistle. The second wave came like weather, slow, gray, inevitable. It didn't crash in with noise, but seeped through every crack I had left unguarded, a dampness of control disguised as concern. Miriam's tone softened, which made it worse. She stopped arguing, stopped insisting, and instead began to speak in the soothing voice of a nurse tending a patient who has forgotten their own name. She called me Mama again, a word she hadn't used since she was 12, and I could feel the falseness of it roll off her tongue like syrup over spoiled fruit. Mama, she said, I've been talking to people. There are programs now for women your age who need more structure. You'd be comfortable there. They cook for you, help with medicine, all of that. I stared at her across the kitchen table, the smell of disinfectant rising from the countertop she'd just wiped 3 times. I don't need a home, Miriam, I said quietly. I have one. She smiled, but it wasn't a smile. It was the polite curvature of lips before an execution. Of course, Mama, she said, but it might be nice to have someone else around, someone professional. The paperwork appeared 2 days later, folded neatly in a blue folder with cheerful images of elderly women knitting and laughing on the cover. She placed it beside my plate at breakfast, like a gift. I didn't touch it. "Just look it over," she said. "They'll do an evaluation next week. Routine stuff." Her voice was calm, but her eyes gleamed with the ferocity of someone who had already decided what would happen. I nodded slowly, buying time. I had learned that resistance must now be invisible. The open defiance of earlier months had only fed her narrative. I had to become fog, present but impossible to grasp. That afternoon she called a doctor, one I had never met. His name was Dr. Larkin, a man with soft hands and the expression of someone perpetually apologizing for existing. He asked simple questions in a tone designed to make me sound fragile. "Do you ever lose track of time? Do you find it difficult to remember words? Do you sometimes feel unsafe at home?" I answered each one carefully, aware that every syllable would be used as evidence. "I lose track of time when I read," I said. "Words only slip away when someone interrupts me. And no, I don't feel unsafe at home. Only when people try to move me out of it." He blinked, wrote something down, and told Miriam he'd follow up. When he left, she closed the door and exhaled, like a marathon runner crossing a finish line. "You didn't have to be so defensive," she murmured. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity. I wasn't defending myself. I was surviving cross-examination. In the days that followed, I sensed the noose tightening. Small privileges vanished under the guise of safety. The back door was nailed shut because of the draft. The curtains were drawn, so you won't strain your eyes. Even the clocks were changed, set 5 minutes fast so I would miss my favorite radio program and fall asleep earlier. I began keeping track of real time again, carving small lines inside a drawer with the tip of a hairpin, one for each sunrise I still saw from my own window. The hairpin became my compass, my secret tool, the same one that could open a lock when the world decided I wasn't fit to hold keys. One night I overheard her talking to someone on the phone. Her voice was low but sharp. "Yes, the assessment went fine," she said. "She's declining faster than I thought. We'll move ahead with the guardianship papers. No, she won't resist. She's tired." That word, tired, cut deeper than all the rest. I sat in the darkness of my room, my hand clutching the whistle beneath my pillow, and felt something cold and clear rise inside me. I wasn't tired. I was waiting. There's a difference. The following morning, she found me in the garden, trimming the rose bushes. She frowned. "You shouldn't be using sharp tools." I wiped my hands on my apron and said evenly, "Roses need pruning, or they rot." She opened her mouth to reply, but didn't. Something in my tone made her step back. I think she realized, if only for a moment, that the woman standing in front of her was not a relic, but a survivor, rehearsing her return to herself. After that, she started locking the shed too. It was around then that the letters began arriving. At first, I thought they were more of her bureaucratic tricks, but the handwriting stopped me. It was familiar, looping, uncertain, a mixture of youth and sincerity. My grandson, Kieran, the boy who used to sit beside me while I taught him to tell time by the sound of train whistles echoing through the valley. His letter was short. "Grandma, where are you? Dad says you've been unwell, but I don't believe him. I tried calling, but the number's blocked. I miss you." He had written a new number beneath his name. I pressed the paper to my chest, the words trembling like wings. For the first time in months, someone had spoken directly to me, not about me. I knew Miriam had intercepted previous letters. There was no other explanation for the sudden gap. But somehow this one had slipped through. I hid it under the loose floorboard near my bed, alongside Henry's note and the small envelope of cash. Evidence of existence. That letter changed everything. The thought of Kieran, alive, curious, still tethered to me by something unscripted, lit a flame I didn't realize I still carried. I began planning, not wildly, but methodically, as I once planned train schedules. Logically, precisely, without wasted motion. I wrote to Henry using the post office box of the Rail Workers Union, knowing Miriam would never check there. I told him I might need help soon, that there was more at stake than property or pride. His reply came a week later, hidden in a plain envelope marked Maintenance Notice. He wrote that he could help me relocate quietly, that there were programs for retired employees in smaller towns with subsidized housing. You'd be safe, and you'd be free, he wrote. Say the word. Meanwhile, Miriam intensified her campaign. She began recording our conversations on her phone, pretending it was for her therapist. She would ask questions designed to trip me. What year is it, Mama? Do you remember Dad's middle name? When I answered correctly, she laughed and said, just checking. When I hesitated, she would tilt her head pityingly. It was performance art in cruelty. Then one afternoon, she brought a social worker, a young woman with gentle eyes and the posture of someone who believes in paperwork more than people. Miriam introduced her as Clara. Just here to make sure we have all the support we need, she said. Clara asked if I felt comfortable at home. I said yes. Miriam interrupted. She means, do you feel safe? I looked at both of them and smiled. As safe as anyone standing on the edge of a platform. The words hung between us, heavy with meaning only I understood. Clara returned a week later, this time without warning. Miriam wasn't home. She asked if everything was fine, her voice cautious but kind. I looked at her and made a choice. There's a file in the second drawer of the desk, I said. Take it. Inside were copies of my bank statements, the fake prescriptions, and my notes detailing every manipulation. She hesitated, uncertain whether to involve herself, but I said, if something happens to me, make sure someone reads those. She nodded slowly, took the file, and slipped it into her bag. When she left, I felt lighter and terrified all at once. It's one thing to suffer. It's another to document the suffering and send it into the world. Documentation is defiance. That night, Miriam confronted me. What did you tell her? She demanded. She said you seemed distressed. I looked up from my knitting and said calmly, I told her you make excellent tea. The lie slid out easily, practiced from years of survival. She glared, then laughed, a brittle sound. You really are losing it. But there was something new in her expression, a flicker of uncertainty. For the first time, she wasn't entirely sure which version of me she was dealing with. That was my first small victory. The real escalation came a few days later. I woke to find my bedroom stripped. The framed pictures, my books, even the radio, all gone. In their place, a single chair and a nightstand with a locked drawer. Simpler, she explained when I demanded to know why. Too many distractions were making you anxious. The air in the room felt thin, unbreathable. That afternoon, she brought a nurse. A man this time, tall, polite, expressionless. He checked my blood pressure, nodded, and told her I seemed stable. I wanted to scream that stability wasn't the same as consent, but instead I smiled and said, "Thank you, doctor." The nurse left, clearly uncomfortable. I could see it in his eyes. He recognized the tension in the room but didn't know where to place it. Miriam closed the door behind him and said quietly, "You're not well, Mama." I'm doing what's best. The next morning, I found the front door unlocked for the first time in months. I don't know if it was her mistake or her test, but I didn't hesitate. I took my coat, my bag, and the envelope of cash. I walked out as if I were simply going to the corner store. The sky was pale, the air damp. At the end of the street, I turned toward the station. My legs ached, but each step was a reclamation. I reached the platform, the same one where the world had tried to finish me, and sat on the bench. Henry was there, waiting, as if he had known I would come. "It's time," I said. He nodded. Within an hour, we were on a northbound train, the landscape sliding away behind us like discarded memory. As the train gathered speed, I looked out the window and saw the reflection of my face superimposed over the passing trees. I didn't look frightened. I looked awake. Miriam would find the house empty, the bed neatly made, the lock still in place but meaningless. She would call the police, perhaps, or pretend to. Then she would begin rewriting the story again. But this time, I would have already told it myself. Henry handed me a thermos of coffee. "You did it," he said. I shook my head. "Not yet. Doing it is easy. Staying gone is harder." When we reached the next town, I checked into a small motel under my maiden name. The room smelled of dust and pine cleaner, but the bed was soft, and the air was mine to breathe. I called Kieran from the payphone outside the station. He answered on the second ring. "Grandma?" His voice cracked. "I'm here," I said. There was a silence so thick it felt sacred. "Are you safe?" he whispered. "For now." "Can I come?" "Not yet," I said. "But soon." He didn't ask questions. He understood the language of survival better than his parents ever would. That night, as I lay in the narrow bed, I listened to the trains passing in the distance. Each one sounded like punctuation, marking the end of one life and the beginning of another. I thought about the woman who had whispered, "Let the wheels finish her," and realized she would never understand what those wheels had truly done. They had not crushed me. They had carried me forward, delivering me to the version of myself she could neither recognize nor destroy. The second escalation had ended not with confrontation, but with movement. I had learned that sometimes you don't fight the storm. You ride the wind it creates. And somewhere behind me, in a house now too quiet for comfort, my daughter was discovering what happens when the object of control decides to vanish on her own terms. The climax of my story did not come with fire or shouting, not with the spectacle of revenge or the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. It came, as real reckonings do, in stillness, when truth ceases to be a weapon and becomes simply an unshakable fact. For months after I left, I lived like someone newly born, uncertain of the rules of breathing. My days passed in small, deliberate acts of recovery, buying my own groceries, folding my own sheets, feeling the ache in my hands after scrubbing a floor no one would see but me. There was quiet dignity in the labor, a restoration of muscles that had forgotten what choice felt like. But freedom, I discovered, is not an ending. It's a kind of responsibility. I still woke sometimes expecting to hear her footsteps, the clink of her keys, the sweet, poisonous tone of her voice calling, "Mama, breakfast." Even in absence, she lingered like humidity. And yet, each morning, when the trains roared in the distance, I reminded myself that sound belonged to me again, that it was not an echo of fear, but a rhythm of direction. The town I chose to settle in was small, its station little more than a shed beside two tracks, but it smelled like iron and rain, the scent of memory itself. Henry had arranged for me to stay in a modest boarding house run by an old widow named Louise, who kept her rooms spotless and her curiosity limited. "I don't ask where people come from," she said when I moved in, "only whether they pay on time." That suited me perfectly. I paid for 2 months in advance, then began volunteering at the station's cafe 3 mornings a week. The cafe was owned by the railway company, a nostalgic gesture to employees of the past. I wiped tables, served coffee, smiled at commuters. To anyone else, I was just another old woman earning pocket change. But to me, it was ritual, a reclamation of place, of sound, of rhythm. Each whistle that blew felt like a small acknowledgement from the universe. You are still here. But peace is not the same as closure, and life has a way of demanding full circuits. One afternoon, while I was stacking cups behind the counter, a uniformed officer entered the cafe. He asked for me by name, my married name, the one I hadn't used since I left. "Mrs. Ellison?" he said gently. My heart tightened, but I nodded. He placed a folded document on the counter. "Your daughter filed a missing person report. She says she's worried for your safety." I almost laughed at the absurdity, but the man's expression was kind, and I didn't want to wound it. "Tell her," I said, "that I am exactly as safe as I choose to be." He hesitated. "Do you want to file a counterstatement?" That question hung in the air like a train idling between stops. For weeks, I had avoided confrontation, believing distance was enough. But distance is only safety. Truth is the only closure. I took a deep breath. "Yes," I said. "I do." The process unfolded over the next several days. I went to the local precinct, sat across from a young detective whose polite efficiency reminded me of my younger self. I told him everything, not as accusation, but as record. I spoke of the day at the station, of the whisper, the push, the campaign of erasure that followed. I gave him the documents Clara had taken from my house, the bank statements, the forged prescriptions, the false medical evaluations. I told him about the guardianship petition, about how she had tried to sign away my life with a blue folder and a rehearsed smile. He listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes, occasionally looking up with quiet disbelief. When I finished, he said softly, "We'll investigate. You've done the right thing." I wanted to tell him that the right thing is often indistinguishable from the painful one, but I just nodded. The weeks that followed were heavy with waiting. Henry checked in often, bringing coffee and quiet encouragement. Louise noticed my restlessness but said nothing, perhaps sensing that some storms cannot be softened by words. I went to work as usual, forcing my hands to stay steady even as my mind replayed every detail of what I had told them. Some nights I doubted myself, not because I questioned the truth, but because I feared the futility of it. The law, I had learned, moves like a slow train. It arrives eventually, but never in time to prevent the wreck. Still, the act of speaking had already shifted something inside me. I no longer whispered my story to the walls. I had spoken it aloud, and that alone was a kind of justice. Then, one morning, the detective returned. He came to the cafe, hat in hand, the look of cautious satisfaction in his eyes. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, "we've completed the investigation. Your accounts were indeed altered without authorization. There's also evidence of medical manipulation and intent to obtain guardianship under false pretenses. We've contacted your daughter." I braced myself. "And?" He sighed. "She's denying everything, of course, but she's agreed to meet with you if you wish, to clarify misunderstandings," she said. He paused. "We can have an officer present." I thought for a moment. "No," I said. If she wants a meeting, I'll see her at the station. Alone. The day arrived colder than expected, a brittle wind sweeping across the tracks. I wore my best coat, the one I'd bought secondhand but pressed to perfection. The cafe was quiet, the mid-morning lull between commuters. I sat at a corner table, facing the window. When Miriam entered, I recognized her immediately, though she looked older, polished still, but drained, like a painting left too long in sunlight. She paused when she saw me, as if she'd half expected a ghost. "Mom," she said finally, "you're alive." The words were meant as relief, but they sounded like accusation. I smiled faintly. "That seems to be your disappointment." She flushed, sitting across from me without invitation. "You didn't have to disappear like that," she began. "You scared everyone." I let the silence stretch, then said, "You didn't look scared when I was lying on those tracks." Her eyes darted away, the mask cracking just slightly. "I don't know what you think happened," she said, voice trembling between defense and pleading. "You were confused. You slipped." I leaned forward. "I was never confused, Miriam. You said, 'Let the wheels finish her.' I remember every syllable." She shook her head. "You're mistaken." I reached into my bag and placed the whistle on the table between us. The metal gleamed, catching the thin winter light. "Do you know what this is?" I asked. "It's the whistle that stopped the train that day. It stopped because they heard my name, not yours. Because for all your lies, the world still knew who I was." She stared at it, speechless. "I've told the police everything," I continued, my voice steady. "They have your forged documents, your statements, your prescriptions. You can deny it all, but the evidence doesn't need your permission to exist." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then her eyes filled, not with guilt, but with fury. "Do you have any idea what it was like?" she hissed. "To take care of you alone, to watch you decay, to know that everything you built would vanish before I ever saw a return? You treated me like an obligation even when I was a child." Her words sliced through the air, raw and unrestrained. "All I ever wanted was to live without being your shadow." I listened quietly, because even cruelty has its reasons, and hers were finally spilling out in the language of someone who had never been brave enough to say them before. When she finished, trembling, I said softly, "Then you should have stepped into the light on your own, not tried to drag me into the dark with you." She looked at me then, truly looked. And for the first time, I think she saw me not as the fragile relic she had been tending, but as the mirror of what she feared to become. Aging, alone, indestructibly self-sufficient. The moment was strangely tender in its brutality. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "You've ruined everything," she said. "No," I replied. "You did." She left without another word, the bell above the cafe door ringing like a final verdict. I watched her walk down the platform, shoulders rigid, and felt neither triumph nor sorrow, only the quiet relief of closure. The official process that followed was anticlimactic. The guardianship petition was dismissed. The accounts were restored. The police took statements, filed reports, but there were no dramatic arrests, no courtroom showdowns. Justice, I realized, is often quiet and bureaucratic. Miriam withdrew into her own life, stripped of the narrative she had written for both of us. I heard later from Kieran that she had moved to another city, that she rarely spoke of me now. That was enough. The point was never punishment. It was recognition. The evening after the confrontation, I stayed late at the station cafe, cleaning the counters after closing. The trains came and went, their whistles echoing through the dusk. I took mine from my bag and held it in my hand for a long moment. Then, impulsively, I stepped outside onto the empty platform and blew it. One clear, strong note that sliced through the cold air. Heads turned, startled. Somewhere down the track, an engineer responded with a long, low reply. The exchange felt like a benediction, a dialogue between what was and what would be. Standing there in the dim light, I understood that the true climax wasn't the confrontation, or even the freedom that followed. It was the reclamation of sound, of voice, of authority. She had tried to silence me with care, to erase me with kindness, but in the end, it was my voice that echoed across the rails, not hers. The whistle still vibrated in my palm long after the train had passed, and for the first time since that terrible afternoon years ago, I no longer felt the weight of survival. I felt something far rarer, arrival. In the years that followed, life settled into a rhythm so ordinary it almost frightened me. There were mornings when I woke and had to remind myself that quiet could exist without fear, that stillness was no longer a prelude to control. I lived in the same small boarding house above the laundromat, where the hum of washing machines rose through the floorboards like a domestic symphony. My window overlooked the station, and every dawn the first train would pass, the whistle low and familiar, and I would feel the pulse of it through the glass like a heartbeat, reminding me I was still tethered to the world. The people downstairs came and went, students, widows, traveling workers, and I learned to live among them without explaining who I was or what I had survived. I had become, in the best sense, anonymous. Freedom, I discovered, is not about being known. It's about being no one's obligation. I still worked at the cafe, not out of need, but out of devotion to the ordinary. There was a holiness in serving coffee to commuters, in wiping down counters, in offering small kindnesses that cost nothing but attention. Some recognized me now as the old dispatcher who had once stopped a train by name, though the story had drifted into legend. They spoke of it as if it had happened to someone else, and I let them. Let them say it was a stranger who had fallen onto the tracks and lived. Let them say the train stopped for love, or luck, or miracle. I knew the truth. It had stopped because I existed, and existence, I had learned, was reason enough. Henry retired soon after, and the station gave him a modest send-off. We remained friends, the kind that share quiet more comfortably than conversation. Sometimes he joined me for tea at the cafe, and we would watch the arrivals board flicker, the world rearranging itself in schedules and destinations. "You never did tell me what happened to her," he said once, meaning Miriam. I stirred my tea slowly. "She moved away," I said. "I let her." He nodded, understanding that forgiveness and forgetting are not the same, that sometimes mercy is simply the refusal to keep remembering. I had stopped waiting for apologies that would never come. I had stopped rehearsing the words I might say if she ever appeared again. The story was no longer hers to interrupt. Still, traces of her lingered in my body like old weather. There were days when I would feel the ache in my hip from the fall, and the memory of her hand against my back would flicker through me like static. On those days, I didn't fight the memory. I let it pass, like a train in the distance. The past, I came to understand, is not something you bury. It's something you learn to live beside. It hums under the surface, sometimes distant, sometimes near, but it no longer dictates your movement. I would look at the passengers boarding the trains, young women rushing with briefcases, mothers tugging children by the hand. And I would think, may you never know what it feels like to be erased by the one who called you mother. And yet, if they did, I hoped they would also learn what I learned, that identity, once reclaimed, can never be stolen again. One winter evening, a girl came into the cafe. She couldn't have been more than 20. She ordered tea and sat near the window, tapping her fingers nervously against the table. When I brought her cup, she looked up and said softly, "You're Mrs. Ellison, aren't you?" I hesitated, then nodded. "My mother used to talk about you," she continued. "She worked with your daughter once, said there was some kind of tragedy." Her tone was uncertain, curious, but not cruel. I smiled faintly. "There was," I said, "but not the kind that ends a life. The kind that begins one." She didn't ask what I meant, and I was grateful for that. When she left, she thanked me for the tea and said she might come back again. I watched her walk out into the snow and thought how strange it was that life always sends reminders just when we think we've finished listening. Not long after that, I received a letter. The handwriting was careful, unfamiliar at first glance, but when I read the signature, my heart stopped. It was from Kieran. He was living abroad now, teaching. "I found out everything," the letter began. "She told me her version, but I knew there was more. I looked for you for years. I'm glad you're alive. I'm glad you got away." He wrote that he'd grown into his own life, that he carried my stories with him, that he'd never forgotten how I taught him to count the seconds between train whistles and listen for patterns others missed. At the bottom, he added, "You once said every train knows when to stop. I think I understand that now. Sometimes we stop for the ones we love. Sometimes we stop for ourselves." I read the letter 3 times, folded it neatly, and placed it beside the whistle in my drawer. For the first time in a long while, I felt something warm that wasn't merely survival. The station grew quieter with the years, the schedules thinner, but I remained. They offered to replace me with younger staff, but I refused. I told them I wanted to see it through to the end. "The end of what?" one of them asked. "The end of the line," I said, and smiled. I liked being there for the late trains, the ones that came in nearly empty, their lights cutting through the dark. Those trains reminded me of myself, tired, persistent, still arriving. Sometimes I would sit on the bench after closing, breathing in the cold metal scent of the rails, and imagine all the places I'd never go but somehow belonged to through the echo of their departures. When people ask now how I survived, I tell them I didn't. Survival implies returning to what was. I became something else entirely. The woman who fell onto the tracks is gone. The woman who rose from them walks beside her, shadow and twin. I no longer measure time in birthdays or years, but in arrivals. Moments when I feel the weight of myself return, whole and unbroken. I've stopped fearing the wheels. They are not instruments of death, but of movement. And movement is the closest thing to eternity we ever get. Sometimes young women come to me, waitresses, commuters, strangers who sense something unspoken, and they ask, "How did you do it? How did you keep going?" I always give the same answer, because it is the truest one I know. "You blow the whistle," I tell them. "Even if no one hears you the first time, you blow it again. Louder. For yourself." And when I say it, I see in their faces the flicker of recognition, the understanding that power is not always about volume but persistence, that the act of declaring one's own name can stop a train, a cycle, a lifetime of silence. Now, when the last train of the night passes and the sound fades into the dark, I close my eyes and whisper a small prayer. Not for forgiveness, not for peace, but for remembrance. Because what they tried to bury in noise, I reclaimed in quiet. And if I have learned anything in these long, gentle years, it is that survival is not the end of a story. It is its second beginning, written not in blood or vengeance, but in the steady language of breathing, of choosing, of stillness after motion. I am no longer the woman who waited for permission to exist. I am the whistle itself, and when I sound, the world pauses. That is enough.